Good morning, church. I would like to begin with a question, and let me guess. This is where you sit during Sunday morning services, right? So it's class time, and y'all are just. I'm gonna go sit where I don't have to move then, right? I'm gonna start with a question. Tell me everything that you know about the word covenant. I'm sorry? It's between God and men? A contract? What else?
Agreement between two or more individuals with promises made and binding requirements on both.
All right. Okay. Here's a man who knows what covenant is. Anybody else? There are two of them. Anybody else? Okay. In many ways, this is the reason that we need to know about covenant. I have a class that I teach. I've turned it into a seminar. We're going to hear 3 lessons on covenant today. But I have a class that lasts a whole quarter, 13 45-minute lessons on covenant. And you just told me everything you know about covenant in 2 minutes. You follow me? And so covenant is the foundation in many ways that our faith sits on. It is at its center what we understand about relationship with God, our understanding of holiness, our understanding of salvation, of healing, our understanding or our misunderstanding of what baptism is, the way we worship, the fact that we are delivered, the sanctification, all of those things lie on the foundation of covenant. And without covenant, without a proper understanding of covenant, here's the thing, a lot of those things crumble. As we've seen in our brotherhood, a lot of times, a lot of the strongly held beliefs, the things that we thought were strongly held, seem to be crumbling with our brothers and sisters. And the reason that those things are crumbling is because we don't understand the foundation which everything was built on. All right? So let me start by showing you why covenant is not just a topic that we need to talk about. Covenant is a personality trait of God. All right? It's not just something that God does, it's something that God is. Okay? It's part of His character. This is one of the major things that I want you to see today. This will not be the last time that you hear me say that. But our God is eternally, which means He always has been and He always will be, but our God is eternally a covenant-making and a covenant-keeping God. It's part of who He is. If you take covenant out of the equation, then you no longer have the God that is being revealed in the Scriptures, and you actually end up talking about a different God altogether, right? You follow me? And what does the Bible call that? Idolatry, right? And so this study of covenant is really what it is, even though we're going to be talking about the topic. But by the end of the day, what I'm hoping that you will see is that this is not just a topic, that really what we're talking about is the character of God. And so what I want to do today is let's get to know God better than we knew Him before. And as we discover these things, I think one of the things that you're going to notice is covenant is the vehicle through which God brings us the gospel. Okay? Covenant is a word that describes God's relationship between you and me. And through this covenant, He is going to outline how He wants us to respond to Him, and He is going to outline all of the promises that He's going to make to us if we will respond to Him the way He asks us to. Let's talk about the word testament for just a moment. What does the word testament mean? Huh? I can't hear. The will? What does the word testament mean? Old Testament, New Testament. What's the root word of testament? It means to testify, right? What are they testifying? What's the Old Testament testifying about? What's the New Testament testifying about? They are testifying about the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. That's what they're testifying about. So by making a covenant with humanity, God is binding himself to us, and he is asking us to bind ourselves to him. So what is covenant? At its heart, covenant is a form of relationship, okay? What are some forms of relationship that we have? Let's start with the big circle to get down to small circle. So big circle, what are some relationships that you have? Okay, that's a small circle. Big circle, acquaintances, people you know. You don't really know much about them or anything. You just, I've got an acquaintance over here. And then a little bit smaller is friends, family, right? Yeah, and you get it. So there's acquaintances, there's friends, there's family, then there's nuclear family, you know, me and my wife and my kids. And then you go even smaller, it's me and my spouse. We are closer, me and Tanya here. This is my wife, Tanya. Isn't she beautiful? Me and Tanya are, any teachers in the house. Tanya and I are, we are closer than me and my daughters. Or, again, I messed up again. My daughters and I, yeah. And Tanya and I are closer than Jake and I. Jake's my best friend. Don't hold that against me. Jake Vordenbaum over there. He barely made it to class and his best friend's teaching. Can you believe that? And he's getting red. You're welcome. And so there's all different kinds of covenant, and covenant. All right, so you got friends, you got acquaintances, you got friends, you got family, you got nuclear family, you got your spouse, and then there's something called the blood covenant, which means who is it that I'm supposed to put first? Am I supposed to put God first, or am I supposed to put my wife first? God, right. And so what we learn by that, you all know that, there's priority lists. Well, where does that come from? That comes from covenant. It's the level of closeness, the level of intimacy within a relationship. And blood covenant is the highest form of relationship possible, okay? That's the highest form of relationship possible. The only thing that we have on earth, and specifically in our culture, that even comes close to that is the marriage covenant. But you notice marriage is not like friendship. Marriage is not like all these other kinds of relationships. Marriage requires what? It requires a wedding. It requires a special day to commemorate this. It requires all these different things where you get the groom side over here and the bride side over here, and the people getting married stand up in front of everyone they know and care about, and you get a minister to officiate it, and it's a marked occasion. It's a big deal. There's a covenant ceremony that happens. Jake and I have never had a covenant ceremony, even though he's my best friend. We never will. Just don't get any ideas. We never will. But in ancient times, whenever people would get married, whenever they would get into a covenant, the marriage covenant with one another, they would do this with the full knowledge. I think sometimes we don't really get this in our culture. I wish we could regain this. But they did that with the full knowledge that once they had committed themselves to each other, then everything they owned, everything they were, belongs to the other person. They intentionally would release their personal identity in order to have a merged identity. Well, what does Genesis chapter 2 say about a married couple? It says that the man will leave his father's house, and he will cleave, and the two will become one. Two people became one person. And I know that's a figurative. Yeah, you don't literally become one person. But it's the idea of two people now have a merged identity. All right? So it's much more than just this attitude of, we're connected. We signed a piece of paper and we had a little, we had a ceremony. But really what we are is we're just two people living in the same house and we're technically married. No, So much more than that. So much more than that. So let's talk about contracts versus covenants. A covenant is not a contract. Anytime you hear somebody say that, then you need to look at them from now on and say, oh, bless your heart. But you don't know what covenant is, because if you knew what covenant was, you would never say that it's like a contract. It's not like a contract at all. Take, for example, let's say I wanted to buy a house. What would I need to do? I need to go down to the bank and do what? I need to get a contract, right? What does that contract say? What is the bank concerned about with me? Am I going to make that payment, and can I make that payment, right? That's all they really care about. And there may be a few other things that they look at, but it's only in relationship to the question, can I and will I make that payment? Really? That's all they care about. So what I want you to know is that a contract is only concerned about one aspect of someone's life. All right? If I were to go into the bank and they gave me a questionnaire to fill out, and I were to start writing all these answers down, you know what's not going to be on that questionnaire? They're not going to ask me about morality. They're not going to ask me about religion. They're not going to ask me about that. All they want to know is about finances, right? That's all they really want to know about. The rest of my life is of no concern to them. But see, here, this is where covenant is different than a contract. Covenant is an all-encompassing agreement. In other words, everything that I am and everything that I have, everything that I do, now I'm laying all of that on the table. So, just to contrast, a covenant is everything. A contract is one area of my life. What happens whenever I make the very last payment on my house note? I'm debt-free, right? She's debt-free, that's right. Woo, woo. Except for taxes. All right, but as far as my relationship goes with the bank, now what happens to that contract? You can burn that baby to the ground, right? Not the house, the contract. And so what you learn is that contracts have an ending date, right? Contracts have an ending date. Covenants do not have an ending date. Or rather, as we'll learn here, as far as marriage goes, our covenant with God doesn't have an ending date. As far as your marriage contract goes, when does that end? At death, right? It ends at death. The only way that this is how God created covenant to exist. This is how God originally wanted everything. He never dreamed that we would bring divorce into the picture. Now, I'm not getting on to divorced people. I love you. We talk about those kinds of things later. I'm just telling you, before humanity existed, or as humanity was created, and God created covenant to be in covenant with Adam, divorce wasn't on his mind. But mankind oftentimes find a way to spoil the beautiful things of God, don't we? With God, we get into something called a blood covenant. On earth, the marriage is the highest form of relationship with two people, but when you're in blood covenant with someone, that trumps even marriage, and it certainly trumps the lower forms of relationship. Also, I need to emphasize that there was no way to get out of a covenant. As we talked about, when is it that you get out of marriage? Supposed to be, ideally, how was God's intention with that? Was when you died. Does anybody remember in the Old Testament what happened if you broke your marriage vows? Let's say you cheated on your spouse. What happened? You were stoned to death publicly, right? Why? Because I don't know about you, but that seems kind of harsh to me, because there are other things that you can do in the Old Testament that to me sound like a whole lot better sin. You know what I mean? It sounds like there are things that you do not get sentenced to death for that to me are smaller sins than cheating on your spouse. So why in the world do you have to die if you break covenant with your spouse through cheating? because your covenant ends when you die. All right? And so, if you end your covenant before the day that you're supposed to die, then the day that you're supposed to die just got moved up. Does that make sense? It's all got to do with covenant. So, in ancient times, part of getting into covenant was to sacrifice an animal. During that step, they would use a certain phrase, and we're about to get into the ceremony in a moment. But they would use a certain phrase. And so there's this animal that's about to die. I think that this would bring some solemnity to our current wedding ceremonies, don't you? If something has to die for you to get married, and that's why it's a marriage covenant. This is a blood covenant. Here's where the blood is going to start to come in. Let's say that Charles and I are going to get into a covenant. Not a marriage covenant. It's not what we're talking about. But let's say, for argument's sake, Charles is a king of a country, and I'm a king of a country. Charles has got a warrior tribe, okay? But they need food. Well, I'm the king of an agrarian society. I've got cattle, and I've got food. I can feed them. They can protect me. So let's say that two kings are going to get into covenant. The closest thing we have to this today will be something like a treaty. Those kinds of things. This is not something that's super common for us, but let's say we get to the part where we're going to sacrifice an animal. He and I would slice this animal's throat together, and we would say, I'm going to keep this blood covenant even if I have to die to protect it. I am going to keep this blood covenant even if I have to die to protect it. If I break this covenant, what is happening to this animal right now, I give you permission to make me look like this animal. And so that's how serious the blood covenant was. Let's look at some scripture, because I think it's past time that we look at some scripture. Hebrews chapter 10. Hebrews chapter 10, starting in verse 26. And what I've done so far is I've taught you just a little bit about covenant, okay? Now we're going to go through and we're going to read some scripture, and what I want you to see, maybe for the first time, is all of the juicy covenant language that is throughout Scripture. So Hebrews chapter 10, verse 26 through 31, he says, "For if we go on sinning deliberately after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins. But what does remain, but a fearful expectation of judgment and a fury of fire that will consume the adversaries. Anyone who has set aside the law of Moses dies without mercy on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. How much worse punishment do you think will be deserved by the one who has spurned the Son of God and has profaned the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified and has outraged the Spirit of grace? For we know him who said, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay,' and again, the Lord will judge his people." Do you see all of that covenant language in there? Do you see how, listen, you got into covenant with God. Hebrews is talking to a group of people who used to be Jews. And now they become Christians. They've seen the Messiah come. They became Christians. But guess what's happening? This life is hard. People are persecuting us. And so what's going on in the whole book of Hebrews is basically Paul. I think it was Paul that wrote Hebrews. We don't know who wrote Hebrews actually. But whoever the author of Hebrews is writing to these people and saying, don't give up. And in this verse, he's specifically saying, you all know about covenant, right? You all know about covenant. You know that if you cheat on your wife, then what's going to happen is that you are going to be stoned to death because you break covenant with God, or you break covenant, then you die. And so if you break covenant with God, you are in a serious problem here. This is a big deal. Don't break covenant with God. And so in light of what you know about covenant already, and making themselves look like this animal, if they break covenant, I hope that you're starting to see some of this covenant language here that maybe you didn't or maybe you couldn't see before. God takes covenant very seriously. Sometimes, something else I want you to understand about covenant and death. Nope, I've already covered that. Let's move on. So I know that all these things that we've been talking about sound a little bit harsh. We're talking about death. You die if you don't keep your covenant, all those kinds of things. And these are all kind of negative types of things that we've been talking about. And you need to know them. You really do. You need to know them. This is the negative part of covenant. But I want you to know more than anything from here on out that covenant is not a negative thing. Covenant is a cherished thing. People back then, people sought after covenant because covenant was a highly prized and highly cherished thing to get to experience because of all the positives of covenant. Now, we needed to cover that negative, but now let's move on to some positive because take, for example, a marriage ceremony, a wedding. Is that considered to... Now, those two people who are getting married, they are giving up everything they own. They're giving up everything they are, and it's no longer mine. Now it's ours, right? That's what they're giving up. They're giving up their personal identity and those types of things. And so in a wedding ceremony, they're giving up quite a lot. But is a wedding ceremony considered to be a joy or a burden? A joy, right? Because what you get out of it is so much more than what you just gave up. All right? What you get out of it is so much more than what you just gave up. And so that's the same as a blood covenant. This is how God eternally designed covenant to be, but we as humans seem to find a way to spoil things that God designed. When do I stop? 45, so I have almost 20 minutes. All right, we're doing fine. We as humans find a way to destroy or to spoil the good things that God designed, and we make them bad, and we turn them sour, and those kinds of things. Just like what Adam did in the garden, right? What Adam did in the garden, actually we're going to talk about that in a little bit more in the sermon. God, he broke covenant with God. This was the first covenant. It's called the Adamic covenant. And we're actually not, there's just too much material to cover. We're not going to cover it beyond that. But Adam broke covenant with God. And so God then, this did not surprise God. God knew this was coming. He had a plan before he even made Adam on how he's going to fix what Adam's going to break. But this didn't surprise God. And so, but when Adam broke that covenant, then God begins to unroll a plan on how he's going to get humanity back into blood covenant with him. Now, at this point, I want to run through some things with you that we will be looking more closely at this evening in the evening service. But let's take a look at the covenant-making ceremony. Because today, what I want to do is I want to take you through a general history of covenant. We will be looking at a little bit of scripture here and there, but right now I'm looking at world history, not religious history, okay? I want to look at the history of covenant and where it comes from and all those kinds of things. Let's look at the covenant-making ceremony. There are going to be several steps that are all going to go hand in hand through this ceremony in order to make a covenant. Similar to how we do a marriage covenant whenever we have a wedding, there are many, many steps that we go through, right? There's what happens when you first show up to a wedding and you're not in the wedding party. You come in and you're divided. Groom and bride. Why do they do that? To me, that sounds like a little strange thing to do. Groom side and bride side. Where'd that come from? Then, when the wedding starts, then we have this procession, right, down to the front. And then once they get up here, and they're one standing here, one standing here. They're facing each other. And then it's officiated by a minister of some kind, right? Well, why do we do things the way that we do them? Who decided how the marriage covenant is supposed to go? Who decided that? Why do we do all those things? Well, all of those things come from covenant. and this is really important. I want you to see this. Remember a moment ago we talked about how God's character is covenant. It's not just something He does, it's something He is. Well, that becomes a really big deal to us because of who created us, right? If you were created in the image of God, then isn't it pretty important that we understand the character of God? Because if I'm created in His image, guess what? Part of who He created me to be is a covenantal being because I'm created in His image, and this is what He is. Make sense? All right. So, the first, that's how strong that point was. It was So, we were created to operate best whenever we operate within covenant. Now, on to the steps of the covenant-making ceremony. The covenant-making ceremony was an agreement between two people that had binding consequences for the rest of your life. And what they would do back then is they would meet in an open field. And like say, if two nations were going to get into covenant, or two families, two large families, two clans, if we were going to get into covenant with one another, my part of the clan would be over here, and Charles's part of the clan would be over there. Does anybody mind if it is really, really hot once you get to speaking. Is that okay? I'm done. I'm sweating already, and I don't even have any hair to sweat. So they would, whenever the two parties would get into covenant, when two nations or two families or two clans would get into covenant with one another, they would choose a representative. And so me as the king, or Charles as the king, most likely, most often, it was the king who was the representative. He's the one that speaks for the people. He's the one who, if something happens and this covenant gets broken, you know what I don't do? I don't go talk to one of his advisors. I go talk to Charles. He's the representative. He's the one who is in charge. And it could not be a hired hand. Like say if, back then a lot of times if you were a nation, not always, but a lot of times if you were a nation, you were an ethnic group also, And so Charles, I don't know, you look a little Irish. Are you Irish? Partially? All right, so let's say I'm Scottish and he's Irish, and I come to him and our two tribes, our two nations get into covenant with one another. They would choose someone who's also Irish, and they would choose someone who's also Scottish. They would not choose one of their slaves that came from wherever and say, you know what, why don't you be the representative? That's not how things could work. It was you weren't not allowed to just put a hired hand in there. By the way, which is why part of the reason why I think some of our government stuff is so messed up, because we get hired hands in there, not real people to speak for the people. Anyway, we don't talk about politics at church, right? And it could be said that this person, this representative, that the nation was in him, all right? And as you start to read through some Scripture, in fact, I want to read a little bit of Scripture to you right now, but whenever you start to read through Scripture from now on, anytime you see this phrase, in him, that's covenant language. That's covenant language. All right, Genesis 18, the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. It was pointed out yesterday in our meeting, go read through the book of Ephesians. Ephesians is just dripping with covenant language, especially this phrase, in him, is just everywhere in the book of Ephesians. This covenant representative this person who was the representative, he would embody the ideas, he would embody who these people are, and he was able to speak for as these people would speak. We're going to start to run through a couple of these. So there was the representative, then there were the terms. So before we would meet in this field, we would kind of correspond and decide what are the terms of the agreement. And the terms would often be called the law of the covenant. So if between two kings, this was how, the treaties are signed. They're all written out. This is what your nation is going to be responsible for, and this is what my nation is going to be responsible for. And at the bottom, I'll sign it, and he'll sign it, right? So this is the terms. And 2 copies were made. He gets a copy, and I get a copy. Why? So that nobody will forget what it is that they are promising. Nobody will forget what it is that their responsibility is. Do you remember Moses? And when he was on Mount Sinai for the first time, God wrote out on some tablets what? Say again? 10 Commandments, which is also called the law. And now there were 2 copies. You know all those, right? There's 2 copies. Now, do you think God is unable to write it all on one tablet? Don't we just assume there were 5 over here and 5 over there, right? Then we assume that? Well, what if I were... Now, we don't know. Oh, sorry, what? Well, we don't know exactly. We'll get off on that another time if that's okay. But we don't know exactly. I'm just suggesting something to you. I'm not teaching this as fact. But what if there were 2 copies, because one was God's copy, which was put where? In the Ark of the Covenant. And one was the copy that belonged to the people, and that belonged where? With the people, right? So you know what your part is, and I know what my part is, and there's no confusion about who does what. It's written down, it's signed, all right? Also, when Moses came down the first time with the first pair of tablets, what does he do? He destroys them. Why? Because of the sin of the people. They were not just sin. They weren't just sinning. What were they doing specifically? They were worshiping a golden calf. And so what do you think the symbolism is? It's not vague. What do you think the direct symbolism is of Moses smashing those tablets? Covenant's off. If this is how you're going to act, covenant's off. You don't get this level of relationship and you act like that. That's what that's saying. All right? So there's the law, the terms. Then they were each covenant required an animal sacrifice. Battery's dead. You want to click me one? There you go. Each covenant required an animal sacrifice of at least one animal, sometimes more than one's. Since they would slice the throat, and normally what would happen is after the animal would bleed out, then they would cut the animal in half, and they'd choose one side of the neck or the other, and they would cut it down. They would bisect it, and they would lay. I want you to see this, because this is gross, but it's awesome. They would lay one side of the animal here and one side of the animal here, and Charles and I are standing in a field, and guess what's in between the animal? Everything that poured out of the animal when we cut it in half. All right? There's blood and guts and organs and general grossness, okay? And then guess what we did? What Charles and I would do at this point is we would walk through that mess. I would walk through on this side, and I'd circle back around. He would walk through on that side and circle back around, and we'd meet back in the middle. And now, why would you suppose that we would do something like that? Yeah, gross. That's very gross. Why would we do something like that? Because now the representative is come in contact with the blood. There's blood on my feet. There's probably blood on my ankles, depending on how many animals this was. There could be quite a lot of blood on me, maybe even on the bottom of my robes or whatever. There's blood. Oftentimes at this point, they would call upon the minister or the priest or the pagan priest, general history, and they would ask for that priest or that religious person to, they would ask for him to call upon a deity and say, now, these two people have come into covenant with one another, and what we are asking of you, Yahweh, or what we are asking of you, Baal, or what we are asking of whatever deity they chose, is to, since I can't follow Charles around all day long every day to make sure he does all the things that he's supposed to do with covenant, right? You don't know. You got to trust someone to get into covenant with them. I can't prove that my wife has 100% been faithful to me our entire life because I have not been in her presence every moment of every day since we got married. So the same thing would apply here. And so what we would do, since I'm going to say I trust her, but in the event that Charles betrays me, Lord, I'm going to ask that you smite him. So if he keeps the covenant, then I hope everything goes great with him. But if he breaks the covenant, then I want you to smite him. All right? And that's how they would guarantee, or one of the ways that they would guarantee who it is that's going to, how they're going to make sure that the covenant gets kept. Then there would be something called the covenant meal. Maybe I do need batteries. Here. I'll lay that there. I'm just going to tell you to click it. All right, the covenant. Click it again. All right, back it up to. I missed a slide. There's something called the covenant meal. And with the covenant meal, what would happen is now we'd have a feast. After we've done all these steps, now we'd have a feast, and everyone there is going to eat, and we might roast some of the animals that we just sacrificed and we're going to have a big party, right? Kind of like a wedding reception, right? Have a meal there. Where does that come from? It comes from covenant. Why do we do that? Because of this. Now we do something called the covenant meal, and we take the food, and the first couple bites of whatever it is, maybe the first 1 or 2 bites, I would pick up some food and I would put it in Charles's mouth. I know it sounds freaky, but I would pick it up and I would put it in Charles's mouth, and I would say to Charles as he's eating, Charles, me and my people are now becoming a part of you. And just in the same way that you can never make this bread or chicken or whatever it is we're eating, just in the same way that you can never make this food separate from who you are. From now on, when you eat this food, it's now a part of who you are. It's inseparable from who Charles is. So it is with this covenant. This is a part of who you are. All right? And then he would sit down, or I would sit down, and he would feed me, and he would say that same thing to me. Just like when we feed each other cake at a wedding, right? Where does that come from? It comes from covenant. All of those things have their roots in covenant. Go ahead and click it. Oh wait, back it up. I guess I've got them out of order. Then we would do the covenant mark on the body. A covenant mark on the body means that I would carve, like let's say if he and I are getting into covenant with one another, I would carve his family crest into my arm. And very lightly, I wouldn't break vessels and stuff. I would just, on the outside of my skin, on the outermost layer of my skin, I would have the Davis family crest put there, and then I would rub some dye in it or something so that when it heals over, it's kind of scarred over, but it's also kind of like a scar / tattoo. And what happens, especially back then, but what happens whenever I wave at somebody? What am I showing them? Showing them who I'm in covenant with, okay? And so we do the mark on the body. Then we'd also do the vows, which we've kind of sort of already talked about. We'd stand up in front of everyone and we'd say, this is what I promise to do. And kind of in a way, we would recite the terms. In a way. There's more to it. We don't have time. But they would make vows up in front of everyone. We'd have the covenant meal. Now we'd get to the powerful exchanges. Go ahead and click it. I want you to hear this. This has nothing to do with cannibalism. All right. Anybody that looks at that and sees cannibalism, you do not understand the dripping covenant language over here. It says, "For my flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink. Whoever feeds on my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me, and I in him. You see that? What was he talking about there? What covenant meal do we get to partake of today? All right. Yeah. It has nothing to do with anything but that. Go ahead and click it one more time. Now we're going to get to powerful exchanges and memorials. Now, a memorial. What would... I need to hurry. We are almost out of time. Why would you do a memorial? Why would people build an altar? Because... Go ahead. To remind us. We need to be reminded because oftentimes we forget things we ought to remember, and we remember stuff we ought to forget, right? And so from time to time, people would build altars to commemorate a moment, to commemorate, sometimes they would do it to commemorate a covenant. Go ahead and click it. Let me run through the last couple points. Jump past that. Powerful exchanges. So they would exchange a robe. A robe is the outermost garment. And so if Charles and I were going to get into covenant with one another, I would get his jacket and he would get mine. Now, it was not like the way we have jackets. I've got, 7 or 8 of these. Back then, people only had one, maybe 2. If you're a king, you probably had a couple, right? But most of the time, whenever people saw, and every single one of them was homemade. There was no such thing as going down to JCPenney's. Every single one was homemade. They were unique. Whenever you saw Joseph's coat of many colors, that was unique to, he was the only one in the world that had that coat. And so when you saw him, guess what you thought? Well, guess what you knew? That's Joseph. I can see him from afar. That's Joseph. Then you would exchange belts and weapons. Now, a belt is not the kind of belt that we have to keep your pants up. To them, a belt is something that you held, that you mounted a weapon on. And the belt means your strength. In other words, I give you my strength and I receive your strength. And a weapon means all of my enemies are now your enemies and all of your enemies are now my enemies. Then we would exchange names. Click it one last time. And in the names, remember Abraham used to be called Abram. Well, whenever he got into covenant with God, Abram had part of God's name, the H, put in the middle of his name. So from now on, Abram is no longer known as Abram. From now on is known as Abraham. And also he did it with his wife. Is no longer Sarai, is now Sarah. And from that moment on also, God is no longer just known as Yahweh. He's also known as the God of Abraham. God changed his name too. Then the God of Abraham and Isaac. Then the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And then it was going to get too long, so they just said, you know what, the God of Israel. The God of Israel. That's how I'm known. So that's how he was known. I cannot wait. All right, to get the second half of this lesson is not going to be in the sermon this morning. It's going to be this evening. So if you'd like to hear the final step, the last step, the step that is just going to blow the top of your hair right off your head, then you're going to have to come for this evening. Don knows what I'm talking about.